Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Farley. I'm a member of the Green Party, and what I'm going to walk you through today is a proposal that I and a few others have come up with to help change the shape of the UK private rental sector, but also to improve the housing stock and indeed make it more fuel efficient and emit fewer greenhouse gases. This is not necessarily a party political view. It's just my role within the Green Party is a lot of it has been around sort of costing things and looking at government financing, etc. And a few weeks ago, I wrote an article, which I will link to in the presentation, about how moving the rental sector away from private landlords towards public and social landlords would not only reduce rents considerably, but give us an opportunity to retrofit homes to make them more lower carbon or carbon neutral, and also to improve both the tenure or the security of private renting and also the quality of the housing stock. And it would all be done in a way that not only did not require taxpayer subsidies, but would actually reduce government expenses. And I'll talk about that in a little while. So what I'm going to do here is walk you through that proposal. Maybe close this, that's a bit better. Walk you through that proposal and then also give you some of the details and some of the mechanisms that we're talking about in terms of how that could be achieved. So if you just bear with me a second, let me share my screen and I will take you through this proposal. So I'm calling it the BuyBack Housing because I haven't thought of a better phrase to use. And specifically, that proposal, if it won't let me do it. Right, bear with me a second, sorry. It doesn't seem to like. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the proposal, and apologies for the slightly boring presentation, but I thought you guys would like some of to know the detail up front. So the proposal is to transform private rental homes into high quality, energy efficient, low cost rentals with secure tenure. So no small task, I accept, but nonetheless, we felt it was important to aim for sort of all of the key improvements that we'd like to see. And this would be achieved in 3 steps. Firstly, purchasing those private rented homes in bulk from buy-to-let landlords. And that purchasing will be done either by local authorities or housing associations or community-based housing bodies, retrofitting them to a high standard, both in terms of their comfort and energy performance, and then renting them back or potentially selling them back to tenants at a reduced rate, or in terms of sales via maybe it's like a community land trust model. But either way, putting them back into the community at lower cost. So that is the proposal. So why are we doing it? Okay, so firstly, the core problem around the private rental sector in the UK, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is that it is expensive, taking on average around 40% of household disposable income. Back in 1980, the average sort of renter paid only 10% of their average disposable income on rent. So it's massively increased in the last generation. They have very poor energy efficiency. Only 30% of private rented accommodation has an A to C rating. And that means the poorer households end up spending a lot more of their disposable income on domestic energy, and they emit much higher levels of CO2 than other types of housing. They are generally in worse condition as well. So around 30% of them are classified as non-decent, and 750,000 have a category 1 hazard, which sounds horrific. But a lot of homes, particularly private rental homes, are in such poor quality that they're making their tenants ill. And lastly, they're insecure. So private tenants mostly have short-term agreements with no-fault evictions still in place despite promises. And that leads to really sort of affecting people's lifestyles quite seriously, including people delaying starting a family or generally feeling less secure. So taken as a whole, these problems are depressing the living standards of private tenants, but also contributing to excess greenhouse gas emissions, which we need to address as soon as possible. Okay, so what is causing this overall problem? So essentially, the problem is this. The housing finance is structured in such a way that it favors people who already own properties or other assets. So that asset ownership gives them an advantage in accessing cheap mortgage finance. And what that has enabled over the course of a generation is for younger people, poorer households, or those without assets essentially being excluded from the housing market and pushed into the private rental sector, which in turn allows those speculators and landlords to drive up the cost of renting. Now, one aspect of this that affects the sort of environmental issue is that private landlords overall have been pretty slow, much slower than other areas of the housing market, to make improvements to home insulation, energy efficiency, and so on. Because obviously they don't feel the benefit, so that they don't necessarily feel the urge to do it. They're not paying the higher fuel bills or suffering from the poorer quality of housing. The tenants, on the other hand, who would benefit, generally don't have the power to agree to those improvements being made. So it's led to a kind of a real gap in the market of trying to improve housing stock in the UK. So why are we talking about this now, right? There is at the moment a unique or relatively unique opportunity for the public or social housing sector to grow as the sort of private or buy-to-let sector shrinks. We have at the moment a much greater number of private landlords now looking to sell up, and some of this is speculative, but surveys have been done, research has been done. Basically, tax and regulatory changes over the last few years have made being a private landlord a much less lucrative business than it was before. And there seems to be a move towards more landlords selling up. In addition, there are fewer new landlords coming into the market, and that is sort of notified by a reduction in the number of BTL mortgages. So those easier access to finance I talked about in the previous slide is now being slowly pulled away. So it's more difficult for new landlords and speculators to enter the market. Now, at the same time that shift in the buy-to-let sector is happening, the cost of government and housing association borrowing has fallen rapidly in the last 12 months. Now, obviously, we're in a very unusual situation at the moment in terms of the COVID-19 crisis and the lockdown that has accompanied it. So maybe these aren't necessarily normal times, but it seems at least for the next sort of short while or duration, the ability for government and social housing providers to borrow is falling at exactly the time that it is increasing for buy-to-let landlords. So that previous problem I identified, where the advantage was always with the speculator and the landlord, has now shifted considerably. So the advantage now lies with those social and public housing providers. And that's the thing that's going to bring this opportunity. In addition, there are other sort of changes that have happened as well, as let's say in terms of stamp duty. So social landlords are not liable for stamp duty, but buy-to-let landlords are. Social landlords, public landlords also have much greater sort of economies of scale, so they can manage housing stock more cheaply. And I'll cover all of these in a bit more detail in another slide. But basically, the landscape has changed quite rapidly over the last 12 months, and it looks as though, at least over the next couple of years, it will continue to head in that direction. Although I can't predict the future, so no promises there. So, but this is the opportunity we have right now, and this is why this proposal has come forward in the time that it has. So how exactly would this work? What are we talking about here? The first step of invoking this change is really to ensure that local authorities, housing associations, community housing providers gain access to cheaper finance. Now, it is happening already, but I think with a bit of concerted organized action and with government support, it could happen more effectively and more quickly. Now, once they have access to this finance, they can buy back homes from buy-to-let landlords who wish to exit the market. Any buy-to-let landlord who has any sense probably is looking to exit the market. There are 5.5 million private rental homes in the UK. I'm not suggesting they'll all be sold, but let's say if we assume over the next 5 years, or next 2 or 3 years, we'll have 1 million or 1.5 or 2 million of them selling up. That's a huge opportunity to completely shift the nature of the rental housing stock. Now, once they're acquired, these homes would undergo a retrofit to improve energy efficiency, etc. And one of the benefits of that would be obviously to reduce fuel bills as well, but also obviously to make them a bit more environmentally friendly and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Those homes would then be rented back to tenants at a rent that is substantially below market rate. Now, I would like to see that reduction of at least 20%. We haven't really done a financial model for it yet, so I can't really commit to anything in terms of what can be achieved. But by removing the landlord and by accessing that cheaper finance, we should be looking to reduce rents substantially, in my view. And that's even with the extra investment that goes into the retrofit. Now, once those houses are lent back or even sold, they would be managed and run by local councils, or if they're sold by a community land trust, for example. But basically, going forward, it will be adding to the public or social housing stock. And if the tenants then move on, obviously that can then be relet at social rent to the next tenants. So in a nutshell, that is the process we are looking at. What I think is the sort of selling point for this approach is that everybody kind of gains. So landlords get an easy exit from the market. You know, they can take their ill-gotten gains and walk away, rather than sort of riding the roller coaster of the property market as it's likely to unfold over the next couple of years. Tenants obviously have a home that's warmer, cheaper, and more secure in terms of tenancy. Communities benefit from having longer-term residents with real roots in the area that they live. A lot of private tenants, and I've done it myself, you know, end up having to move every year, every other year. Landlords sort of kick them out because they want to, you know, take back the property or sell it, or in one case for me, you know, his daughter was coming back from traveling and he wanted somewhere for her to live, so I got booted out. Local authorities get an improved housing stock, and as I said, more stable local communities. And central government not only achieves its kind of aim of improving the housing stock generally, but also helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which all political parties are now committed to different degrees of seriousness, I suspect. But you know, there is a political imperative now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and this would be a big help to getting us in that direction. And of course, they'll have happier citizens with more disposable income. And here is where, for central government in particular, it will be able to make savings in terms of housing benefit. If rents are lower in this section, it will depress rents elsewhere, which will reduce demands on housing benefits for central government. So there really is something for everybody. And even investors will make a modest but secure return on the money that's lent. Okay, so what I've set out is just an example of what this would look like for an individual property. And I've taken, I live in Brighton, so this is an average 2-bed flat will be about £300,000. I actually found 2 flats in the same block. One was for sale, one was for rent, and these numbers did work out exactly for that flat. So if we take the example of £300,000 as the selling price, there will be some upfront costs, even if for sort of government or the social sector. But the buy-to-let landlord faces huge upfront costs. They'll have to come up with at least a 25% deposit, around £14,000 in stamp duty, for example. So, you know, a massive, and then other sort of fees, legal fees, etc. So a massive upfront deposit they need to find, and then their average interest rate on the borrowing costs will again be much higher. Now, for central government at the moment, 30-year bond rates are issuing 30-year bonds at 1.25%, which is very low, below inflation, in fact. so real terms, negative rates. But even sort of with housing associations, you're looking at sort of current bond rates at around 2.5%. So they're the kind of baselines that I've chosen. When you factor in other costs that that either the buy-to-let landlord or the public or social sector will face, you can see from the line on total annual costs that the buy-to-let landlord is really facing much, much higher costs now, even than sort of the social sector, which is still borrowing at its own market rates, and really hardly making any margin at all. I suspect most landlords who are in the game at the moment are doing it for, long-term capital appreciation. But if they get a sense that that's not coming, they might decide to do something else with that investment. So overall, there are two approaches to this. If central government stepped in and essentially became the key provider of finance, this could be done very cheaply. You see that minimum rents could fall for this particular apartment by around £800 a month, which is extraordinary, really. Less than half of what is being paid out at the moment. I've gone for a fairly low figure for retrofit costs, so that might go up a bit, but I was just using standard government costings for some of the key areas of insulation and energy efficiency within a home, and I just took the median point. You can spend, almost as much as you want on this stuff if you want to be really perfectionist about it, but a sort of minimum standard retrofit would be at least £15,000 on average. But anyway, so what you can see is even with using sort of market finance for housing associations at the moment, that sort of rate, we're still seeing, savings of around £500 a month for this particular property. The cheaper the property, the smaller the savings, but there should still be savings. The more expensive the property, the bigger the savings. So in places like London, for example, you will potentially see even bigger savings than that, which is, makes a massive difference to the tenant and local economies, etc. So that's just an example of one. In the article that I wrote, I looked at the entire sector and crunched some of the numbers for that. So I thought for balance, it would be useful to, focus in on an individual property to see what the effect would be. Okay, so what's stopping us from doing it? Well, political will is one of them. It's very difficult to sort of shift kind of attitudes around property, as I'm sure you're all aware. The government at the moment doesn't seem to have displayed much ambition to improve the quality or the cost of private rentals. We are the kind of forgotten corner of the housing sector and the economy and indeed everything else. And this government in particular doesn't seem like it's going to be overly concerned about improving that for anybody. So that is a real challenge, but maybe we can tackle it in other ways. The real key is gaining access to the low cost finance. I'm not going to pretend that's easy necessarily, and I'm in discussions at the moment about how we can structure it to be appealing or to capture some of that finance. There is central government money around retrofitting and other grants, and there are local authorities have budgets for certain things. So there might be ways in which we can leverage the funding that does exist, but it is going to be a challenge, and it's probably the core challenge that we need to focus on. It's also, in my view, the reason why we need some central or local government involvement, because they can bring the scale, the reassurance, they can make long-term commitments in terms of expenditure, etc. But they might be reluctant to get involved. They might have other plans, but they just have the logistics, the infrastructure, and the administration to make this work. And I think without local authorities or large-scale housing associations, can be very difficult. Attracting private investors won't be a problem if the government steps in. The investment world is really been turned on its head recently, so it's difficult to really get a sense of what would work and what wouldn't. But it would seem to me that secure, steady returns, or that are virtually guaranteed, would be a very attractive investment in the current climate. There is one issue about we might inadvertently bid up the price of housing. There would need to be governance around sort of purchasing and how it would happen and what the requirements would be. for that, what the criteria would be, and we would have to keep an eye on that. What we don't want to do is kind of be paying more for property than it otherwise would cost. That's not really going to be, well, the seller would be very happy, but it's not really something that would make much sense otherwise. And then the other one is just from this perspective, and one of the reasons I've come to this meeting is finding the expert advice and skills to pull all of this together. It will require different sorts of agencies and groups to work together, including the local authorities, housing associations, community groups, landlord groups, maybe, retrofitters in terms of insulation, but maybe other sort of home retrofitters as well. The people providing the finance, sort of project management. There's a lot of moving parts in this if it were to get off the ground. Not necessarily an obstacle, but more something that just needs to be done. But just to bear in mind that obviously there are always going to be resource constraints in that sense. Okay, so where are we at the moment? Well, this idea has only been floating really for the last couple of weeks. So we're not really too far down the track, but we aim to sort of have the idea defined by the end of this month. And much of this presentation is sort of the detail that we've kind of agreed on, although there is more. And then maybe by the end of August, have an outline proposal that we can begin to circulate and firm up and see what interest there is. By the end of the year, have a sort of defined proposal that we can then take to stakeholders, so the finance providers, local authorities, central government, whatever, that is more robust, has a sort of a financial model, and also some of the retrofit modeling that we need as well, and also sort of have a team in place that was ready to do something about it. Our current aim is to sort of have a pilot scheme or a proof of concept that would take up the whole of next year, where we would maybe look at sort of buying and retrofitting around 50 homes in one local authority. And I live in Brighton, and we're having conversations with a few of the councillors here in Brighton and some of the housing officers at the council. Very early days though, so I'm not making any claims on that. And then by rolling out that proof of concept, that would give us a pretty robust, scalable, workable model that could then be used elsewhere. I mean, and that's the ultimate aim of this. It's not about having one or two nice projects, kicking off. It's really about producing a model that could be scaled up right across the private rental sector, and potentially even beyond that. But one of the things that would need to be in place for that is the financial structures that will allow us to facilitate all of that. And that's really, that's the kind of the flow of oxygen or blood to the system, if you like, that we need, which is those finances. Okay, so at the moment we have a very small team. My guys worked in finance in the city. We've got one body that sort of has done retrofit in collaboration with others, including local authorities and government. We've got one local authority where we're discussing, so I said in Brighton and Hove, and that will help us sort of flesh out this detail. But it would be great to get more input, and it would be great to sort of find more people who would be interested in supporting this sort of model, taking it forward, etc. So obviously, me talking to you guys is one way to begin to have that conversation more broadly. But it would be great if people were interested to have other people's input, or if you knew of other sort of projects that were similar, or other groups that would be interested. That would be fantastic. I've probably run over my time now, but at this point, I guess we can move over to your thoughts or any questions that you might have. Thanks.